All right. Well, I think we've got a bunch of folks trickling in. Just going to get started. We're really excited to be doing this webinar with GT, with the Global Spaceport Alliance, and with TZero. I'm Garrett Linden. I'm a part of 47G. For those that don't know, 47G is the Aerospace and Defense Industry Development Organization for the state of Utah and the broader Intermountain West. And we have over 200 members that are a part of our organization, Greenberg Traurig being one of those. So we're really excited to be doing this webinar with them to talk about spaceports. Utah right now is one of the only states, if not the only state, that is looking statewide to find the best area for a spaceport, including evaluating infrastructure, talent, business potential, economic opportunity, all of the above to figure out where the best place to host a spaceport is. Utah actually has a long background of spaceports. When the space shuttle program was going on, and they were finding a spot for that, Utah was one of the four finalists. And we lost as a result, mostly because of the fact that we didn't have an ocean to drop boosters into. Now you don't need oceans, and you can just catch your rockets after they take off. And so it opens up a lot of opportunities for states like Utah and Colorado, who have advantages that come from altitude and other geographic reasons. If you haven't heard of 47G, or if you're not a part of 47G, we invite you to join. Feel free to reach out to me or anyone else on the 47G team. We exist to bring together partners and make initiatives and collaboration happen. So, like I said, Greenberg Traurig is one of those fantastic partners. John Huber on the call here is our point of contact here in Utah. He has a fantastic background, and GT is willing and ready to help with whatever you stand in need of from a legal perspective. And I'll let John kind of give the overview of his firm. But they have some resident experts on space, as you'll see from this call. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, John, to kind of give the intro on yourself and on your relationship with us and firm as a whole. And then we'll turn it over after that to Skip in the panel.
Well, thanks, Garrett, very much. And thanks to 47G for co-hosting this webinar with Greenberg Traurig and other partners who you'll meet here as we get started. We're a proud member of 47G, and I enjoy being a board member and offering what I can to Utah Intermountain businesses that are in the space and satellite, aerospace and defense area. I come from a long history of public service, most of that with the Department of Justice and serving as a presidential appointee under both President Obama and President Trump, which, if that sounds strange to you, it should. If you didn't believe in Bigfoot before I said that, you might now, because I'm the only person on the earth who can say that last sentence of being appointed by those two. But it was an extraordinary experience. And when I stepped down from government service, I wanted to continue to work on big, broad horizon projects. And so landing with a global law firm, Greenberg Traurig, and open an office here in Salt Lake City was a great opportunity and a great privilege. One of my main goals is to help businesses, individuals, companies in the Intermountain West to have access to world-class talent. And that's why we teamed up with 47G. Today's webinar will be the first of an intended three-part webinar series this year in partnership with 47G, where we will assemble subject matter experts, panels, to provide the best information to Utah companies and individuals who are aspiring for opportunities and hoping to overcome challenges in this area. So today, obviously, we're talking about spaceports, very timely, as Garrett mentioned, in Utah's pursuit for such an opportunity, and we're going to get down into the nuts and bolts today. Our next in this series is intended to be focused on Golden Dome defense system, which at the news this last week is all the more relevant for us who live and reside safely here in the United States, and we want to continue to do so. So look for future notices about that, and we hope that you will attend and participate to hear those subject matter experts. Today, our webinar discussion will be moderated and led by my good friend and law partner, Skip Smith, who's just on the other side of the Rockies from me in Salt Lake City. He's in Colorado Springs. He is the leader of our law firm's space and satellite industry group. He's a space lawyer, and quite literally, he is an Air Force Academy graduate, which we're very proud of. And having a daughter who just graduated from the Naval Academy, which is the academy in my mind, it's nice to, sorry, Skip, it's nice to, to have Skip and what that means for us to see an Air Force Academy graduate who went on to get a doctorate in space law from McGill University. He's practiced space and satellite law for over 40 years, and it's been great to be by his side and to learn from him in this exciting area of the law and exciting area of business opportunity. Skip has represented spaceports in the United States and knows just about everybody in the industry. And I'm going to turn it over to him, and he will introduce our panel of experts, which is illustration number one of who he knows and able to convene such experts on our behalf that we'll learn from today. So, Skip, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you also to 47G for helping us do this event. I think it's going to be very interesting. Spaceports are a big topic right now. So let me introduce the panel. Then they'll each have time to make, express some words about their areas of expertise and thoughts on spaceports. And then we'll get into a Q&A format, and I have some questions to ask our experts here, and then we'll give the audience an opportunity towards the end to share their questions with our experts here. So first, I'd like to introduce Hans Carlson. Hans has a master's in aerospace engineering, former Air Force, where he was involved in satellite operations, launch, and classified programs. He founded TZero in 2014. They're a registered launch broker with launch experience really around the world. He's worked with over 40 new space companies with business development and government markets. When he was in the Air Force, he conducted Space Force development efforts for NRO, Southcom, and others. So great background. Also have Costas Spurlock, one of my partners. Costas is part of our space and satellite practice. He focuses on project and public finance, guides clients that are involved in complex infrastructure projects, such as spaceports, particularly those utilizing government financing and public-private partnerships. He previously served as chief of staff and senior advisor to the chief counsel of the FAA, and at the state level, he's held several high-level positions in the Indiana government. Last month, he was the keynote speaker at the Global Spaceport Alliance conference in Orlando, talked about some tax and infrastructure aspects that we'll get in today. And then finally, we have Dr. George Nield, a fellow Air Force Academy graduate. Won't go back to John with any of the Naval Academy jokes that we have, many of them, but we'll just let that pass. But George is an Air Force Academy graduate. He's also got a master's and PhD in aeronautics and astronautics from Stanford and an MBA from George Washington University. Very importantly, he was the FAA's Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation for 10 years, from 2008 to 2018. Also, in March, he got to fly, last March, March 2022, he got to fly to space on the fourth human space flight of Blue Origin's New Shepard rocket. So he got to really be out here like I'm pretending to be. And he's the chairman of the Global Spaceport Alliance. So we've got a great team of experts here. And I really would like to start, because those of you who are following spaceports are following the tax aspects. And so I'd like to go to Costas for the first question and ask him, how does the new law, how has the new law changed the tax issues with respect to spaceports and related infrastructure projects, and how does that enhance the ability of to attract private investment and commercial partners.
Yeah, this is probably one of the most, in my view, one of the most significant changes for space and space finance, not only for governmental, those on the government side, but also those in the private sector side. As a larger overview, one of my goals with this webinar is to get the LEDOs, the local economic development officials, talking to those that are more in space. My conversations with those at the Department of Commerce as well as at the FAA that are involved with spaceports, they really view this change in law that I'll go into here in a second as about economic development. They view the way to promote space and the exploration of space, the space ecosystem, is to try to figure out some way to supercharge it from an economic development perspective. So what happened, and this is part of um, the big beautiful bill that was adopted. There was a simple amendment, quite candidly. I don't mean to oversimplify, but it out of over an 1,100-page bill, one page of amendments allowed for spaceports to be financed essentially like airports and a lot of other infrastructure. And it's a real acknowledgement that space is very much a part of our transportation infrastructure system. Just like roads are, just like airports are, just like ports are, they would benefit with taxable and tax-exempt financing. And the benefit of taxable financing is basically it's very similar to getting a loan. The structure is very similar to a loan structure, the underwriting, and I can go into that. But you're roughly going to save. What it does is cost savings in terms of your borrowing cost, anywhere from 150 to 225 basis points. And to put some context on what that means is that's roughly, say, on a $30 million project. You're saving roughly about $400,000 in interest costs in your first year. Over the course of a 15-year bond, 15-year loan, you're saving close to $6 million. So that's a lot of capital that can be used. It's a lot of savings that can be used. What the law actually did was make an amendment that effectively spaceports can be financed very similar to airports. It literally, if you look at the amendment, they just added in the section that talked about airports, spaceports. But it also added something else that's very unique. It added a component called space parks. So very similar to industrial development parks that for the private sector, a private industry that is located near a spaceport, that they can also benefit from taxes and financing for their capital improvements. So, in the bond world, we call those types of bonds private activity bonds. So you have, if you will, governmental bonds that is for governmental specific projects, but also private activity bonds, which are for private sector companies that are doing work in an area that our federal government has now indicated is a qualified facility because it is very much integrated into our national transportation system, and it's a priority. So that's an overview. I can get into more specifics as we talk, but Skip wanted to give that a high level overview, and I'll leave it with this. The impact of this is that Barclays, the investment bank Barclays, estimates that this will create about grow into a $25 billion municipal market. And this is capital that has never been available to the space industry on the government side or on the private sector side. And this is significant, particularly if you think about how you get your financing. This is a whole nother bucket of financing of money that has never been available and now is. And it really puts a lot of control into those spaceports on the government side, as well as on the private sector side to be able to access this money. And it's for those that are in the municipal finance and economic development world, it's a big deal. So we'll talk more about this in terms of the type of development that this could possibly create not only the space industry, but the jobs and the economic development that's around that.
Thank you, Costas, because that's really, I think, the elephant in the room for this discussion here today. That that's the biggest development. It's a big development, and so it brings spaceports to the fore. And now I want to turn it over to Hans to give your overview of how you see us moving forward with spaceports and why it's important.
Yeah, thank you, Skip, and appreciate the invitation from 47G and from Greenberg Traurig to support this webinar today. Grateful for all the work that you're doing in Utah as well. I have a little bit of a shout out for my Utah roots with my degree from Utah State University in the Aggies. So have enjoyed the opportunity to work with the Spaceport Committee and others in Utah as they look at expanding some of these important capabilities within the state of Utah. I think that what Costas was talking about, where you're looking not just at an orbital launch capability, a specific facility just launching rockets, but you need to really expand the aperture to a more comprehensive set of capabilities that can be economically viable and that can sustain itself and support a range of industries and companies and infrastructure, not just the specific launch piece, but also things like manufacturing, test operations, other things like that. And I think all of the commercial space port operators that are making progress have recognized that and have really transitioned to grow the largest amount of that. There's a tremendous amount of investment in space, and the space market is expected to grow significantly, obviously. You can talk through both on the government and the commercial side. There's a tremendous amount of demand. At TZero, one of the areas that we are kind of unique is that we work both in the government sector, but also in the commercial sector. And we work both on the technical side, helping to launch satellites, but also on the commercial side, where we do a lot of background information, market survey type things like that, investor due diligence, those types of things. So we have a very unique perspective of both the market and kind of commercial demand, but also a lot of the technical factors that are required to be able to do that. So when you look at potential spaceports around the world, obviously you start with the major facilities at Cape Canaveral and Vandenberg, even places like Wallops and Kodiak, Mojave have significant operations, and those I think are expected to grow. They're investing pretty heavily. There's been a large amount of conversation about how Cape Canaveral is reaching its limit, but it keeps expanding and more. And so that center of gravity, that center of mass that's there really attracts new folks. And it's because it's not just the launch providers that are there, but also all of the supply chain support, the manufacturing, the operations, the logistics, being able to bring cryogenics in, other things like that are important enablers for the success of that. And so as you look at the market and where that demand is going, there is obviously going to be a room for the major spaceports, but there's going to be significant demand, I think, in the coming decades for additional operators. And I think that the regulatory environment is going to catch up to the point where inland spaceports like Utah and others have the opportunity to make a more significant contribution. But in order for those spaceport facilities, we'll use the term spaceport, I think, throughout this webinar, but really, I think you're talking that industrial development complex that Costas talked about. That's a really good kind of way to look at this. It needs to be a much broader capability that attracts and sustains a larger number of companies that create those synergies that are necessary for successful a range of operations.
Great. That takes us to George. George, you had 10 years of experience in the FAA and now leading the Global Spaceport Alliance. Give us your broad picture perspective on spaceports.
Thanks very much to 47G and to Greenberg Traurig for organizing this session. So I think this is a very exciting time for commercial space in general and for spaceports in particular. You're all familiar with some of the numbers. Space Foundation estimates that the global space economy is $613 billion, and there's a strong consensus among economists and finance experts that the global space economy is likely to exceed $1 trillion per year in just the next few years. So from the Global Spaceport Alliance perspective, we believe that much of that growth can take place at or near spaceports. And the reason for our assessment is because of our view that, building on what Hans was talking about, spaceports are not just places from which to launch rockets. Rather, they can also be focal points and technology hubs to enable the creation of an overarching economic ecosystem for space-related activities. So I look forward to talking in more detail about some of those activities later on during the session.
Thanks, George. Costas, coming back to you, you've talked about the tax-exempt financing. So how does that help? Okay, we can get objects into outer space, but also how does it spur job creation and stimulate economic growth in the surrounding communities?
Yeah, so those on the call that are economic development folks will appreciate it. It's when you have companies, particularly space, defense, aerospace types of companies coming. I mean, those are high job, high technical entities. When you have those types of companies that are moving, in an area that's near, the local spaceport, it's going to be creating, a very sophisticated type of job. But you should also be thinking about it in terms of what are the ancillary. I mean, when you have those kind of companies that are coming in, you then see typically things like incubators, whether they're STEM incubators, other types of ancillary businesses that are coming there. And quite candidly, when you create this economic development momentum in this area, you also have things that are not necessarily space related. You have the hotels, you have housing that starts developing, and you increase the tax base by creating this attraction. So it's not just about jobs, it's also about increasing the tax base. If you increase the tax base, that sometimes has the tendency to actually lower the tax rate in those areas. But it also should get people thinking not just about the taxes and financing for this infrastructure. That's more what I think of as seed finance, a lot of seed financing that's now available. But for those that are in the economic development space, you're also talking about tax increment financing, which is a state statute. You're talking about opportunity zones. You're talking about other types of public financing mechanisms that can be layered on top of these projects and then be layered and levered to further develop these ecosystems. And Skip, let me end this comment on one point is, a lot of folks have asked, what does that mean to be near a spaceport? And we don't actually have guidance from the IRS or Treasury on what that what near means. But if we look at some past IRS regulations that we have in the context of port authorities, it's roughly about a 30-mile radius. So,
Wow.
Maybe with spaceports, it's more or less, but just to give people a context of what near means, again, we have some guidance based off of ports, which I think is a good analogy, that it could be around a 30-mile radius. So, again, my hope is communities are thinking very broadly about what a spaceport is, what a space park is, and the impact that they could have for their communities.
Thanks. Hans, coming back to you, what capabilities, facilities, and overall support systems do launch operators and satellite manufacturers, what would they be interested in at a commercial spaceport? What do they want to see?
Well, I think that the root of that question is what do your customers want? What do the users of these facilities want? And I think in my experience, too many spaceport developers or folks that are looking at facilities like that, they start with, all right, where would it be convenient for us to put a facility and how could it benefit us from a tax standpoint? When really the conversation needs to start with their customers. There's obviously a technical aspect to this from a safety perspective. There's certain places that are better to put You want to be far enough away from population centers to be able to have safe space operations, space lift operations, and other operations. But you also want to be close enough to centers of gravity and population centers to be able to leverage all of the transportation infrastructure, all of the travel infrastructure, all of the other types of things that having cities close by brings. And so starting with a conversation with partners and understanding what they're going to need from a clean room facility standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint, from the ability to bring in specific commodities or materials, things like that. What are they going to need from a manufacturing standpoint? What is the local community going to be able to provide, and where are the potential educational leverages, universities close by that can be able to support and build and help provide a steady stream of folks that can fill those high profile jobs that we've talked about. Utah has some excellent universities that have excellent space programs that can leverage those types of things, and other states do as well. And so you're really looking for a private-public partnership that starts with customers and understanding what their commercial needs are, what their market needs are, what their technical needs are, and then combining that with where the potential sites, what they have to offer, what they could provide, and where those investments are, and wrapping it in a structure that Costas talked about, where there are tax incentives and other things, so that it makes sense from an economic standpoint. Because at the end of the day, if you can't make money at that facility with a broad, diversified range of operations, the facility is not going to be successful. So those are some of the things. The one last thing I'll add to this is, in my experience, you really need to have a anchor tenant or two for specific that can commit to long-term operations. And there's a lot of things you can offer those tenants up front. You can give them, cost incentives, obviously, but you give them kind of first priority, the ability to, to conduct operations with minimal interference, those types of things. But having one or two kind of anchor tenants, I think, is a key factor of success that I've seen in other facilities.
George, I'm going to come back to you. I was at the Global Spaceport Alliance conference at the end of January in Orlando, and there were a lot of people there. I was quite surprised. Not only a lot of people, but from around the world. So there's a lot of people looking at spaceports and establishing spaceports. So that begs the question: how many spaceports do we really need? What's the market now and in the near future?
So that's a great question. I've heard a lot of folks, including some senior government officials, say, why do we need more spaceports? We already got Cape Canaveral, we've got Vandenberg, so what's the issue? And I guess I'd like to use a little bit of analogy there and ask, how many airports do we need? And who knows what the answer to that is, but I can tell you that we have more than 20,000 airports in the United States today, more than 40,000 airports in the world. Right now, the United States has 14 FAA licensed spaceports, and of course, most of those have not been conducting launches on a regular basis. But we've heard the talk about the interest, the investments. We're seeing the number of launches carried out every year go up. And if we look at the potential, especially thinking of it as not just a game of numbers and launches, but rather the economic benefits and so forth, then I think there can be a tremendous number and have them be successful. Again, the Houston Spaceport has never conducted a single launch, and yet they're one of the most successful spaceports in the world in terms of tenants, revenues, jobs, partnerships, job training pipelines, all those kinds of things. The community just loves the Houston Spaceport. Maybe several years before they actually do any launches. So it really depends on the community, what your vision is, what your capabilities and strengths are. Basically, to answer your question, I think, how many spaceports do we need? as many as it takes to ensure that we can guarantee access to space for all users, meet our national security objectives, provide technological leadership and economic competitiveness, respond to our scientific curiosity, and serve as an inspiration to our students. And that number is probably pretty large, and we're not there yet.
Well, that's interesting. You're right. We got a lot of airports. Hopefully, one of these days we'll need a lot of spaceports. Costas, coming back to you on some of the tax aspects. What are some of the potential long-term economic benefits, as well as risks for local governments in supporting tax-exempt financing of spaceport in the broad term, the infrastructure as well as just the spaceport launching area?
Yeah, sure. And George kind of teed this up. It's you really talking about diversifying your tax base, your business base, your ecosystem. George's comment about airports and spaceports is, there's a lot. George could probably speak better to this than myself, where you have airports that are also spaceports, and so there's a strategic. They can operate independently of each other, but depending on the community, there might be some sense that to be able to get that designation as a spaceport in at that airport and be able to do some of the things that Hans also talked about, in terms of creating those incubator systems. I'm based out of Chicago, and there's a huge push here for quantum. And where that is used, it won't be only Chicago, right? Same concept with, I think, with spaceports and space technology and the defense industry. It isn't only to those current 14 spaceports that they need that. The type of technology is significant. In terms of risk, I think you also need to be smart. Like any project, Hans brought up, partnering with folks. I'm learning from folks that, the Global Spaceport Alliance, George, I'll toot your horn for you, is a great place to get resources in terms of understanding how it's done, best practices. I think that's really important. Having those, again, as Hans mentioned, having those anchor tenants and attracting those anchor tenants to build upon that is key. You're creating an ecosystem. And I think that's very important in terms of making sure you have those strong partners and you have the community buy-in at the elected level and also at the community level, so that you can kind of see you see a long-term growth. You brought it up earlier about partnering with the education community within your area. I think that's absolutely key, and arguably that might be one of the biggest benefits is the jobs that don't exist yet, right? That's a lot of what I think the space industry is about. It is at the forefront of technology, and being thoughtful about that. I think that is a great way to hedge your risk, and then and get the benefits of that can be provided through the ecosystem that you're creating.
Thanks. I'd like to focus a bit on the regulatory aspects associated with spaceports, and I think I'd like to start with George, since that's what he did for 10 years in the FAA, and then go to Hans, because Hans helps companies clear those regulatory hurdles. And so, George, give us an overview of what the regulatory regime is for spaceports.
Okay, excellent question. So let me back up just a little bit for some context. So the top level legal framework for spaceports and other space activities really is the Outer Space Treaty, which more than 100 countries have ratified, and including the United States. And in Article 6, it talks about the fact that non-governmental activities in space need to be authorized and continuously supervised by the state parties to the treaty. In other words, the individual countries that have signed the treaty. So it's really up to an individual country exactly how they choose to do that. In the United States, under our law and regulations, it's the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation that is responsible for overseeing and regulating both commercial launches and reentries and the operation of commercial launch and reentry sites, or spaceports. And so if you look at following that, first I want to say that you only need to get a license for your spaceport if there actually is going to be a launch. So all these other space parks and Houston spaceport activities and working with academia and research and ground testing and so forth, you don't necessarily need a license for those. You can start those right away as soon as you've got folks that are interested in doing that. But when we're really getting down to launching, then you need to have a launch site operator's license in place. So what does the regulations look like for that? You'll find those on the website under the FAA regulations. Part 420 is the name of the regulation. And just in top level terms, basically, to get a license, the FAA needs to go through a policy review. So they're taking a look at foreign policy and national security policy to make sure that what is being proposed does not have any concerns or conflicts there. There's a safety review. So the FAA is going to take a look at the proposed location. And you don't actually have to have a rocket in place yet. It doesn't even have to exist, but you need to have a description of what that launch vehicle is going to look like. Is it a vertical launch or horizontal? How big is it? Is it reusable? Is it expendable? Is it suborbital or orbital? And what trajectory or what directions is it going to fly when you actually do the launch? And that's going to determine whether the location that's being proposed makes sense from the FAA perspective. There's also the requirement, of course, to have a control of public access. The FAA is all about the safety of the non-involved public, and so you need to have fencing or other ways to ensure that folks don't get too close. Typically, there's propellant tanks or other explosive materials that are located on a spaceport, and those have to be handled appropriately with protection, again, for the public. If there's a chance of lightning striking a vehicle during the hazardous operations and thereby endangering the public, then that has to be either predicted or prevented or some other mechanism to ensure that that's not an issue. Then there has to be an environmental review. That can be one of the longest poles of the license process, actually. And that's not made up by the FAA. That's because of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which spells out a process. Doesn't say yes or no, but it spells out the process that you need to do anytime there's a major federal action, such as granting a license. And then finally, there needs to be in place some agreements with the Air Traffic Organization and the Coast Guard so that when the launches start taking place, they can issue notices to airmen or notices to mariners to make sure people are aware of the impending activity and can stay clear of that. So that's just a top level view of the regulations, but you need to get that application all filled out appropriately, and the FAA is happy to help you to do that. And once they have reviewed that and conclude that you have met all the requirements in the law and regulations, then they'll issue you that license.
Hans, how do you help companies clear the regulatory hurdles that are out there?
Well, the regulatory regime is there for a purpose. Obviously, the public safety and being able to protect those who are uninvolved, as George described, is the core piece of this. Obviously, we want to protect the environment. We want to do all of those things as good stewards of our communities and our nation as we do that. And as George mentioned, that's primarily mandated, the regulatory piece, from Part 420, the FAA regulations for spaceport operators, and then Part 450, which is the licensing for launch operators. In the past, I would say that the regulatory has really been a more significant constraint, particularly for new launch providers. As the number of new launch providers has grown significantly over the last decade and a half, there's been a big push to push back against the FAA to try and be a little more flexible and a little more responsive to some of those things. And I think we've seen absolutely through some of the recent executive orders and changes in the law that the FAA and others are really responding to that, both because it's the right thing to do and because there's a demand and a push for that, but also because for a lot of technical reasons, it makes it easier to do that. The number of launches, obviously a new launch provider that's only launched a couple times is going to have a different level of oversight than someone like SpaceX that launches 2 or 3 times a week and has a very established concept of operations. As the launch vehicles themselves and other types of operations we've talked about, suborbital launch or horizontal launch or other things like that, as they get more mature, as they, from a autonomous standpoint, the ability to, control flight termination systems and other things like that more autonomously, as they have the ability to land back at the launch site and incorporate reusability into their technical architectures. As that becomes more mature, that gives regulatory bodies greater confidence that these organizations would be able to operate, and that allows greater flexibility. So I think there's both a market push. There's so many more launch providers coming on board. There's so many more launches happening. The cadence of launches is happening. The FAA and others have just had to be more responsive. And there's always a little bit of frictions and stuff there. But I think that the trend is moving in the right direction, and the technical capabilities to enable that are also progressing as well. From a satellite operator perspective, they also have regulatory constraints that have to be factored in as part of this, and there's increasing demands and some flexibility there as well. But all of those factors have to be brought together to maintain public safety and have a reasonable regulatory oversight process, but also to recognize that the market demand is pushing, that the number of launches is growing, that it's in the national interest of the United States to expand our access to space, to proliferate the number of launch vehicles that have access to launch sites, and from a resiliency and other standpoint, to have more spaceport operators. And I think that's going to require a little bit of additional support from a regulatory standpoint to provide that foundation that allows some of these commercial spaceports to be more commercially and economically viable. And I think one of the key things that's really going to be a tipping point that's going to open up a lot of those opportunities is once the FAA and others get more comfortable with that inland launch from places where you're not launching directly over the ocean, but you're launching over land areas where there's some level of population. That I think is going to open both from an operational standpoint for launch providers and folks trying to get to orbit, but also from a broader market perspective, a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, I'm going to start feeding in some of the questions from our audience here, and we're going to stay on the regulatory aspects for a little while, and talk a little bit more about the inland launch, the point-to-point, suborbital, perhaps orbital, but we have countries around the world, Middle East, recently Kenya put out a RFP for commercial feasibility study for a spaceport in Kenya. So what are some of the regulatory challenges, George, from doing that point-to-point inland, either launch or landing?
So again, the FAA is only responsible for U.S. citizens or U.S. companies that are conducting those launches anywhere, or anyone who conducts launches here. And similarly, in terms of spaceports, the U.S. is only responsible for spaceports in the United States. But safety is key. And so when we talk about a new kind of mission, like point-to-point transportation, we need to really understand, what does that mean? What is the risk? Right now, if you look at human spaceflight in general, there have been a little over 400 human spaceflights by the United States over the years, and 4 of those have ended in fatal accidents. We had an X-15, we had 2 space shuttles, and we had an early model of the Virgin Galactic Spaceship Two. And so that's about a 1% fatal accident rate. Well, airlines today have a risk that is about 10,000 times lower than that. And so it may take us a while to get to that level of safety for those who are going to fly on the rocket. Right now, the US system uses an informed consent process where you have to say, yes, I know it's risky, but I'm willing to go anyway. So I sign a waiver, just like if you're having a major medical operation and so forth. But in terms of launching of satellites or launches without people on board, the key is the uninvolved public on the ground. And so in the early days when rockets were blowing up at a regular rate, that's why you saw the launches taking place out over the ocean, so that if the rocket exploded or if they had to send a signal to explode the rocket because it was going off course, it was easy to do and the pieces would just fall in the water. Or you'd fly it out from the middle of the desert where there weren't a lot of people around. But as was mentioned, now that we're seeing smaller, reusable, and more reliable systems, we're starting to say, hey, we can do this. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the coast, but we're going to have to take a look at the trajectories, and the FAA does a thorough safety analysis. What if something bad happened here? What if it happened here? What if it happened here? And what do the pieces look like? And we don't want the folks on the ground, our facilities on the ground, to be damaged. We have a system set up where you have to have insurance, so in the event that there is a bad day, then the third parties can be compensated for the damage that they might incur. But that's something that's going to have to be looked at very closely, and that's why proposed spaceport locations are going to have to think about what kind of rockets do they envision and where would they fly? Is it just up to the edge of space and then back down, like for scientific research or suborbital space tourism? Or is it actually taking satellites to orbit? And if so, is there a trajectory that would allow you to overfly populated areas at a speed and altitude such that even if something bad happened, you wouldn't have pieces falling on the public? So those are the challenges, but I think they're doable if we do it carefully and thoughtfully.
Well, let me stay on that for a second. Is there, how serious is the risk right now, the downflight risk from a spaceport, and should inland spaceports say no for the time being?
Just to start off the discussion, I think the answer is, I'm very bullish. I'm more positive. I think if we do this carefully, we can do it safely, but we need to be thoughtful about exactly what kinds of launches make sense and what the reliability has been demonstrated. We don't think twice now when a 747 flies over our house or our neighborhood. And yet there are still airplane crashes. So what is the probability and what is the outcome if we do have a bad day? And those are things we have to study and talk about.
Hans, what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, and echo the comments that George has made. There's you start with the technical foundation of what the casualty analysis is. When you do the safety analysis, you have a specific type of analysis called a casualty analysis that looks at where the population centers are and what the azimuth, the flight azimuth is, what the characteristics of the vehicle, how much explosive potential, all those things. And sometimes you're kind of tied down. I mean, if you're in a location where surrounded by population centers, it's really difficult. And that's why traditionally you've launched out over the ocean. But a lot of the operations now, as I mentioned, there's some tweaks you can make that really make it much more feasible. Changing your flight azimuth direction a couple of degrees can have a huge impact on that calculated risk to the public. Doing reusability, having the ability to stage in different approaches, things like that. There are a variety of operational workarounds that can really build on that. And so I think that from a technical standpoint, the feasibility of doing those type of launch operations is increased significantly. We've worked, going back to kind of the point you made just a few minutes ago about launching around the world. We've worked with, both with U.S. partners as part of foreign military. We worked with a number of foreign countries that are looking at doing spaceport operations. We've looked at commercial sites around the world and stuff like that. It's interesting that one of the requirements, even though, as George mentioned, that Part 420 and Part 450 apply to the U.S., really the U.S. has become kind of the de facto regulatory regime for the world, except for, kind of the China sphere of influence operations. The reason is because any launch providers that are U.S. launch providers or have significant U.S. launch content from a hardware or technical standpoint, they have to go to the FAA for launch licensing to be able to conduct those operations. And so really the FAA and their regulatory structure is really applies throughout the world, even if you're in an overseas location, which is an important factor. The other thing that's really critical there is countries that are overseas that want to be able to apply with that, they typically will need what's called a technology safeguard agreement with the United States, and they need to be adherents to the MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, or something similar like that. That essentially means that they won't proliferate some of those technologies around the world. So there are some additional steps and hurdles that foreign countries have. But from a safety perspective, I really think that a lot of the new technologies with autonomous flight termination, with reusability, some of the other things that George alluded to are really going to open up some additional opportunities there beyond the traditional launch over the ocean dynamic.
Georgia, I want to come back to you because we have a couple questions from the audience here relating to the Camden Spaceport, which was really defeated by environmental groups. There was another, I think, effort in Michigan that was similarly handled. So these days, it seems like almost any place you want to put a spaceport, you're going to have some opposition from environmental groups. How is as the Global Spaceport Alliance, have they done anything to help areas that want to establish spaceport push back on those actions by environmental, and how is AST handling that now? Short question, right?
So great question. So from the FAA, from the government perspective, not their problem. If somebody brings them an application and it's going to be safe, they're going to grant the license. Is it going to make money? That's a different issue. Do people get mad? Different issue. That's not the FAA's charter. But in terms of the importance of that, hugely important. And certainly the Global Spaceport Alliance is doing what we can to share lessons learned, best practices, advice, ideas on how to ensure that you don't get pushback from the community. And frankly, one of the best approaches is to be proactive and not wait until the resistance happens before you start fighting back. And a key to that is open, transparent communication, involving the community. Here's what we're trying to do. Here's the potential benefits for the community in terms of jobs in the economy and tourism or whatever other benefits that the local community can identify. And then keep them posted on things. And then the second part of that, of course, is have realistic goals and expectations and plans so that people don't say, oh, well, I live outside New York City and we want to put a launch pad for the Starship right next to the city. That's just not going to work. But I think most places can come up with some kind of scenario in terms of either launching or space-related activities that would make a spaceport successful. But if you want to have community support and not get the pushback and lawsuits and all the rest, as we've seen in a couple of locations over the years, then the key is to build that trust, build the communication with the local community.
Okay, I hate to keep hitting you up here, George, but we've got some more questions here that are aimed at spaceports off the coast. We had sea launch. And so if you're, outside of territorial waters, outside 12 nautical miles off the coast, what, if any, jurisdiction would the FAA have for that type of a launch?
So great question, and we've got real data from history that answers that basically. It doesn't matter where you launch. If you are a U.S. citizen or a U.S. company, you are required to get a license from the FAA. And so if SpaceX decides to launch from Australia, they still needed a U.S. FAA launch license for that. There was an entity called Sea Launch a number of years ago that was international in nature, but Boeing had a big part of that. Ukraine and others were also partners, but the U.S. had a key interest, and so they had to get a license from the FAA, even though it involved basically sailing a modified oil derrick out to the equator and conducting a launch and then coming back to their port at Long Beach. And so there's no question about can you get outside FAA regulations or limits just by launching somewhere else? The answer is no, you can't. And so that's what we have to deal with. At the same time, it's a great idea, because if you launch offshore, then it really simplifies and makes easier ensuring that the operations will be safe. So why does that make sense for inland spaceport or other spaceport locations? Well, if there's a geographic limit or some other concern, there's a way to think about partnering with or subcontracting with another entity so that you do all your preparation, your training, your payload prep and all that at your location, and then you bring the system out to the port or other location that is going to actually do the launching offshore. And there's been some studies and discussions about doing that even with existing spaceports who see a chance to broaden their market by using that approach.
Yeah, we've got like 1 minute left. So Costas, I'm going to come back to you. I've been leaving you alone for a while here. I think because I think you've already answered this question, but I'm not sure. And that's to qualify for the tax-exempt financing under the new federal law. Do you have to be a qualified FAA launch facility, or can you be just a space park? Does there have to be launch associated with it?
Yeah, right now, that's actually a very good question, because we don't necessarily have specific guidance from that. The law's been new, so we're anticipating that. But right now, it's the language of the amended law is specific to, spaceports and space parks. And there's not a definition of necessarily of space park other than a general, this is where the business of space and space entities goes in there. And so right now, it's not specific as to whether you need that specific license or not. I think that's a conversation that as you're planning, you need to have in terms of this is what we want to do. I think there's also, in terms of doing that due diligence, the question of what's your strategic plan for your spaceport, right? Are you going to be conducting launches, or is the economic development value more what you're trying to get, where maybe the vertical launches aren't part of it, but it's more the creating that ecosystem and then evolving into that. And so that's something I think that each specific area community is going to need to examine in order to figure out that question is part of the overall strategic plan. That, as George talked about, the FAA is going to want to understand, why are you putting it here, and it doesn't make sense. And I think you're going to see more and more of this. Years ago, we were seeing launches maybe one every two a week. I think now the average is we're averaging one a day. And just in the last couple months, there's been a lot of discussions about the number of satellites that different companies are trying to deploy into space. That's only going to increase, and there's the demand for that launch cadence, that increased launch cadence, is only going to be there. So it is really going to be a fascinating economic development driver, I think, for a lot of communities.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. I see we're out of time. Still, we have a lot of questions from the audience that we didn't get to. I apologize for that, but we're limited to an hour right now, so I think we could keep going for another hour. But anyway, thanks, Hans and Costas and George. Thanks, John Huber and 47G, and I think we'll be signing off.
Thank you.